Hello, my name is Nancy Cushing. I'm really pleased to be addressing this group and excited to be part of this project. So thank you to the organisers. And I'm going to talk today about creating a market for Australian coal, the Australian Agricultural Company, 1825 to 1840. Now, this paper probes the period when coal, colonialism and private capitalism joined forces in Australia. That is, the first 15 years after the granting by the British government of the sole right to extract minerals in the colony of New South Wales to the Australian Agricultural Company in 1825. At significant junctures like this one, there's an attraction to trying to identify a distinctive energy transition, one which might offer hope as the world faces the urgent need for a transition from greenhouse gas producing fuels to sustainable sources of energy. But scholars in this field have shown that energy transitions don't work like this. According to Awabakal Smil, they are partial, halting, and particular to places and peoples. For Anne Barak, in a keynote address at the recent Material Life of Time conference, the whole concept of an energy transition is flawed. Rather than leaving past energy sources behind, he argues, when a new energy source comes into use, it is added to those already in place, and the outcome is generally an expansion and intensification of energy use. Accepting these insights, I am interested in whether the conditions of settler colonialism in Australia being undertaken by the country where the incorporation of coal into the metropolitan energy system was most advanced, just at the time when coal-fired steam was beginning to transform transportation and industry, affected the reception of locally mined coal in the colonies. On a continent where for 60,000 years the human inhabitants had relied on renewable energy sources, including water, the sun, their own muscles, and the muscles of other animals, how hard did the Australian Agricultural Company have to work to try to sell its coal? And what were the barriers, if any, to its use? I will argue that coal in early colonial Australia was not a highly sought after commodity, but one for which markets had to be identified and cultivated. The identification of coal in New South Wales in the late 18th century had been greeted by colonial authorities with delight, not only because any means to make the penal colony pay its own costs was welcomed, but also because of the new cachet associated with coal, as it became an important energy source in Britain. The first reports of coal were greeted with instructions related to imperial commerce. When informed that a seam of coal had been found near Botany Bay in 1798, the Duke of Portland directed Governor Hunter, as soon as possible, to establish an ongoing trade to the Cape of Good Hope. Not only did he anticipate that New South Wales coal could supply the Cape with coal more cheaply, but that the ships could return with much needed livestock on board. Coal was an imperial commodity, but not of a conventional type like wool, timber, or products of the fisheries, which were produced for sale on the home market. Instead, in order to profit from coal, markets would have to be created in places without their own coal industries, which were adopting British coal-burning technologies for transport and industry. South Coast coal was left for later years when interest shifted north to the mouth of the Coquun River on the unceded land of the Awabakal people. The Coquun had been given to the English name the Hunter River in 1797, but the perceived importance of the coal led to it being known as the Coal River, as you see here, and in 1804 to the secondary penal station established there being given the name Newcastle. The first export of coal was to Bengal and then to the Cape in 1801. This coal did not impress, being poorly handled and full of impurities. My colleague Julie McIntyre will talk more about the relationship between the Awabakal and their Warramai neighbours and coal. But with providing work for convicts being one of the aims of the settlement, Indigenous people were not forced or indeed permitted to provide labour for the mines as occurred in some other colonial settings. They did play a role in convict discipline by recapturing any runaways in return for maize and blankets. And no doubt the satisfaction of removing intruders from their country. exemplifying Smil's point that every transition to a new form of energy supply has to be powered by the intensive deployment of existing energies and prime movers. The muscles of convicted arrivants were the key source of power in the mines, undertaking the mining, wheeling, baling, and loading. By the 1820s, this human energy was supplemented by more than human sources: bullocks, who pulled the coal in drays to the wharf, and a horse, who operated a gin or whim to lift coal and workers from the mine and operate pumps for drainage. Sporadic exports continued to Calcutta in exchange for Bengal rum and as ballast in some convict transports and supply ships sailing on to India or Batavia. The amount of coal leaving Newcastle annually only exceeded 1,000 tonnes in 1809 and 2,000 tonnes a decade later. Small amounts of this coal were purchased in Newcastle and then resold on the open market in Sydney, just 150 tonnes in 1819, but most was retained by the chief engineer for government use, selling it only at a relatively high price which flattened demand, or bartering it for goods needed for public works. Newcastle coal was sent to Valparaiso, Batavia, Lima, Rio de Janeiro, Madras, Calcutta, and the Ile-de-France, which I'll refer to as Mauritius, in the 1820s, but issues around the quality of the coal, limited output, and the cost of shipping meant that no ongoing trade was conducted. The phase of state-controlled production and distribution began to come to an end in the mid-1820s. In January of 1820, Newcastle had been visited by Commissioner J.T. Bigg as part of his brief to investigate and make recommendations on the future of the running of the colony. Two of Bigg's recommendations were to have a direct impact on the commercialization of coal mining. The first was that a joint stock company should be formed to advance economic activity with a focus on raising fine-wooled sheep. This led in 1824 to the formation of the Australian Agricultural Company, which was, in a rather breathtaking land grab, granted 1 million acres of land in New South Wales in exchange for an undertaking to invest £1 million in the colony and employ a convict workforce. This shows some of the land later allocated to the Australian Agricultural Company. It wasn't a straightforward process as to which million acres they would receive. The company's first annual report demonstrated its commitment to wool, which it asserted offered a greater prospect of national benefit and certain individual emolument than any other commercial enterprise in modern times. So, taking that into account, it was somewhat surprising then, early the next year, when at a special meeting of the Australian Agricultural Company's Court of Directors, they heard a proposal from the governor of the company to offer to lease the government coal mines at Newcastle. This was in response to another recommendation from Bigg that limited term coal leases be granted to private individuals or entities who could develop the resource while paying the Crown both an annual rent and a percentage of the coal. This was in keeping with the aim of reducing the imperial government's direct involvement in economic development of colonies and shifting the risk and capital investment to private companies, many of which were established on similar bases to the Australian Agricultural Company at that time. In the context of a mining bubble in the British stock market and rampant speculation on British and colonial railway companies, it was not surprising that the AA Company shareholders consented, with no discussion recorded, and in due course, Earl Bathurst agreed to allow the company a virtual monopoly on mineral extraction in New South Wales in the form of a 31-year lease, in return for selling the government up to 1/20th of the coal raised at market price. The July 1825 report of a special General Court of Proprietors of the AA Company revealed this agreement, claiming that the coal was as good as the finest sea coal in England and anticipating sales in the towns of the colony and its region. With 5 of the AA Company directors also on the board of the East India Company, there was a particular interest in Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, where they could supply coal for steam navigation through the eastern seas and the rivers of our territories in that quarter. knowing that the East India Company already had several steamships. Indeed, India was the second largest export market for Boulton and Watt steam engines between 1775 and 1825, using them for pumping water at docks, ironworks, minting coins, running spinning mills, mining, and shipping. Markets were also anticipated in Batavia, Canton, Singapore, and Mauritius for use on land and in steam navigation. From the beginning then, the company anticipated that it would be producing coal for Indian Ocean ports, both within and beyond the British Empire. Their coal mining would further colonial projects by employing convicts, generating export duties for the colony, facilitating economic activity in other colonies, and fueling the new steam vessels which linked these colonies and their metropoles. The company acted quickly, dispatching a mining establishment equipped with its own 2 steam engines in 1826, when they reassured shareholders that with an accessible regional market, this valuable commodity should lead to a fair, remunerating profit for them. Several years of wrangling over the exact terms of the lease followed, during which the company's local committee attempted to have them withdrawn from the arrangement, partially because of the reported discovery of a rich seam of coal on the banks of the Ganges River, which would mean there was no market for Australian coal in India. This was likely a reference to the deposits in the Burdwan district of Bengal, where in close parallel with Newcastle's timeline, coal was first discovered in 1774, industrial scale mining started in 1815, production expanded in 1824, and output had reached 15,000 tonnes in 1832. Considering this to be a reason to withdraw, again attests to the company's early focus on an imagined export trade. Eventually, an agreement was reached, and the AA Company coal mines came into operation in 1831. With up to 78 convict workers assigned to the mines each year and a core of 5 free immigrant miners, the output of the AA Company mines rose steadily through the 1830s, from 5,000 tonnes in 1831, expanding with the opening of additional shafts to 13,000 in 1836 and 30,000 in 1840. Rising to 40,000 tonnes in 1842 before a fall with the Depression in the 1840s, and recovering by 1847 to 41,000 tonnes. Now, I just thought it was interesting to note for scale how much coal that actually was. Let's have a look at the current ships carrying coal away from Newcastle, several going in and out each day. They have a capacity of 165,000 tonnes of coal. So we're talking about really minuscule amounts on an annual basis compared with what is occurring now. But I'll just go back to that slide. The 6-year delay between being offered the lease and beginning production provided the company with time to investigate how they would sell this coal in a colony and a wider region, which already had a range of renewable energy sources, principally human and non-human muscle, whale oil, wood, water, and wind. In their favour was the rapid adoption of coal as an energy source in Britain, where by 1800, coal fueled 90% of the heat generated. When settler colonists arrived, they experienced a reversal of the trajectory followed in the metropole in the previous decades, and they were conscious of this. Some, including Governor Brisbane, tried to block the granting of the monopoly to the AA Company, declaring that the coal resource should remain with the government because, based on British experience, he could see that coals are very productive of revenue, although that had not been the case during the time that the government was in control of the mines at Newcastle. After first also resenting the granting of monopoly, the editor of the Sydney Gazette accepted the claim that privatising coal mining would reduce coal prices locally, as well as opening up a profitable trade with India for steam navigation. An adequate, permanent and cheap supply of fuel was recognised as a public good, suggesting that at least some saw a place for coal in the colony's energy mix. Still, a shift to coal was not a natural progression, but required active promotion by the Australian Agricultural Company. The person who began the company's coal marketing efforts was Commissioner Sir Edward Perry, a former Arctic explorer and hydrographer royal, who arrived in Australia in December 1829. Perry's social and professional status opened the way for him, and he used it to advantage. He was conscious of the role of the media, placing an announcement of his position in the Sydney Gazette on arrival and arranging to have copies of the Gazette and the Australian sent to him at the company's Port Stephens base on Warramai land, 30 miles north of Newcastle. When coal from the new AA Company mine was coming onto the market, Perry had an advertisement placed in the Sydney Gazette, but also contacted the editor directly with what amounted to a press release, asking him to draw attention to the very superior coal they were selling compared with that from the government mines and the reduction in loading time. He offered to provide a comprehensive account of the coal works, which was certainly quite unique in this colony. When a rival paper, the Sydney Monitor, reported that one coal shaft in Newcastle might have to be abandoned, Perry requested a correction. His letter was duly printed, and he subscribed to the Monitor so he could keep an eye on what they were writing in the future. Following on from the company's original intention to supply markets around the Pacific Ocean, in 1830, Perry sent questionnaires to merchants in Mauritius and Calcutta, asking how much coal was consumed there each year, for what purposes, where it was sourced, and how much it sold for, as well as the current and planned use of steam engines, the fuels used, and how much coal these colonies would be likely to buy from New South Wales and what would be a competitive price. Seeking to protect the reputation of Australian Agricultural Company coal, in August 1830, Perry wrote to the commander of the ship Norval, which was about to leave for India, and asked that a sample of the very superior coal recently identified by the company's mining superintendent be taken to indicate to merchants and others there what might be expected in the future, and to obviate any unfavorable impression from the poor quality coal that they were actually taking as their cargo. This attention to possible export markets was not rewarded. Customer dissatisfaction with the quality of sample shipments, the difficulties of navigating the port at Newcastle, costs of transporting coal to markets, and a colonial duty per tonne of coal exported all kept the export tonnages low. With only 833 tonnes of coal recorded as being exported in 1832, these went to other British colonies, foreign states, and the fisheries. Some went to Van Diemen's Land, where transport cost duties and profit-seeking raised the retail price from the 8 shillings charged at the end of this wharf in Newcastle to 35 shillings a tonne in Hobart in May 1833. By 1839, only 2,300 tonnes of coal were being exported of the 21,000 tonnes of coal mined, with most exported to the open category of other British colonies, which by then included South Australia. There was one speculative cargo of 250 tonnes sent to Madras, where it was considered as good as coal from the north of England. Another 190 tonnes were sent to the British governments for steamships based in China in 1840. And in the early 1840s, coal was exported to Valparaiso and Lima, following an agreement between the AA Company and the Pacific Steam Navigation Company. On any measure, this was very limited success for the export trade in which such high hopes had initially been placed. Like the government before them, the company had to look to domestic demand within New South Wales. While still in government control, most of the coal shipped to Sydney was retained for public purposes, including heating the homes of senior civil and military officers. Coal was used by blacksmiths in their forges and sold as maritime stores to departing ships. Steam engines were beginning to appear, with one available to grind wheat at Coquun Bay from December 1825, but steam engines did not necessarily consume coal. In May 1830, Perry sent off another of his questionnaires, this time to the proprietors of the 3 steam engines then in Sydney, asking about their past use of Newcastle coal, querying at what price coal of a good quality and reliable supply would need to sell to displace wood as their fuel, asking about the power of their steam engines, what the average weekly consumption of wood was, and if change to coal were made, how much would be required each week. As Perry's questions indicate, wood was an entrenched fuel, and it was not readily displaced. Not only were people familiar with and satisfied with wood, but it was also entangled with the colonial project. While underground coal mining used little surface area, firewood production was extensive, furthering the destruction of Aboriginal places and disrupting traditional livelihoods. Wood was considered a valuable byproduct of opening new land, and indeed, there was a view that wood should be favoured as a fuel and coal suppressed to ensure that those advancing settlement by clearing land for cultivation continued to be encouraged by profiting from selling the felled trees as firewood. The timber on one estate near Sydney was valued at £40,000 in 1830, which was said to reflect a growing scarcity of firewood and its rising price. And of course, firewood had its own vested interests as entrepreneurs entered into agreements with householders and businesses such as public houses and bakeries and with the government to supply them with regular deliveries of billets of firewood for a set price or to allow people to collect their own firewood from a site. While prices did appear to be rising in central Sydney, there is no evidence of the types of lower grade energy substitution with peat or rushes undertaken when wood was becoming increasingly scarce in Great Britain, or of the forest conservation measures, widespread theft of wood, and charitable provision of fuel to the needy that were occurring there. These were all factors which opened the way for coal as a domestic fuel in Britain. Playing multiple roles in the economy and society, wood retained its place as the fuel of choice. And I just want to briefly mention another fuel being used, another energy commodity in use in New South Wales. It was also deeply enmeshed with colonial projects, and that was whale oil. A product of what were called the southern fisheries, in 1831, sperm whale oil was both a local energy source and the most valuable export leaving the port of Sydney, outranking even wool. When issuing tenders for fuel and light, the colonial government sought sperm whale oil, common oil, and candles, as well as firewood. I think there's more research to be done here on how important an energy source this whale oil was. But as the examples of firewood and whale oil indicate, households and businesses used a variety of energy sources for particular purposes. As coal became more affordable, plentiful, and publicised under the Australian Agricultural Company, it was added to some people's energy mix. They used it in a discerning way, with some preferring wood for cooking, for example, and coal for heating elsewhere in the house. Turner notes that the AA Company was stockpiling coal for the winter by the mid-1830s, suggesting that coal was being used for domestic heating, and so there was a seasonal increase in demand. But it had an unpleasant and unwholesome smell for noses accustomed to more fragrant wood smoke, and would have been avoided by some for aesthetic reasons. Coal was adopted as a fuel of choice more readily in Newcastle itself, where it could be consumed without the expense of shipping. This was the pattern in Britain, where in the absence of efficient transport, the use of steam engines remained closely associated with sites of coal mining, with steam not overtaking traditional sources of power until the 1840s with the expansion of railways, and not until the latter half of the 19th century in other European countries such as Germany, Italy, and Sweden. The AA Company replaced non-human animal power with a coal-powered steam engine for lowering miners into the pit and raising the coal and water early on in its operations. To use some of the less saleable small coal, the AA Company began planning an evaporative salt works late in 1831, and by 1834 was producing coke for sale. Perry encouraged James King in a proposal to manufacture glass in Newcastle, although it did not eventuate. In the 1840s, a steam-powered Tweed mill was conducted on the north shore of Newcastle Harbour at Stockton, and coal was used in the smelting of copper ore from South Australia. It was this burning of coal more than the mining of it which gave Newcastle its reputation as a place of environmental degradation, which persisted even as much greater volumes of coal were burned and air pollution generated in what became its major markets in Sydney and Melbourne. The greatest success for the AA company in its coal sales was in the emerging technologies of the period, which were closely linked with coal. The best customers were the owners of steamships. From the introduction of the first steamer in 1831, a steady market for coal was created, and the coal-fired steamship Sophia Jane played a role in the pageant of the official opening of the company's mines, waiting at the wharf, you can just see it in the right in this picture, to take on the first load of coal. And that's a later drawing of it in the bottom right. Although the early steamships retained sails which could be used while at sea to reduce their coal consumption, later in the decade, each steamship was estimated to consume about 1,000 tons of coal a year. By the end of the 1830s, when the Hunter River Steam Navigation Company was established, steamships consumed around 1/3 of the company's annual output. Lighting with coal gas was another innovation brought to Australia in the 1830s, which generated steady sales for the AA company from the Australian Gaslight Company. The Gaslight Company's imported system of iron distribution pipes was the first such energy network in Australia. And as was noted at the time, Sydney was the first city in the Asiatic world, and indeed in the Southern Hemisphere, to be provided with gas lighting when the silver radiancy was turned on for the Queen's birthday on the 24th of May, 1841. So to conclude, the Australian Agricultural Company's addition of coal mining to its portfolio in 1825 seemed incongruous at the time and pushed the enterprise in an entirely different direction than had been anticipated at its conception. Based on their perspective as a well-connected businessman in the imperial and colonial elites, its directors imagined a promising future for the coal industry, identifying potential markets around the Indian Ocean world in the colonies of Britain, France, and the Netherlands. Company Commissioner Perry conducted a campaign of research and information, but a variety of barriers prevented the establishment of this export trade in the 1830s. Instead, the primary market was domestic, and even here, the advance of the use of coal was slow because of the commitment of settler colonists to existing sources of energy led by firewood, which served multiple purposes in the colonial project. Although the British settler colony of New South Wales might appear to have had the right conditions to be the site of a rapid energy transition from renewables to coal, there is little evidence that one occurred. Thanks very much.